This story begins one dark night in one very large mansion. The owner of this mansion was screaming at the other man. He was calling for help, saying that this psychopath would not spare their lives for anything. At this moment, the man who stood looking at him thought that so much effort had been made to provide him with the money he needed. However, it was apparently all for nothing. He realized that he needed to escape as soon as possible before the new king killed him. First, however, he was going to get rid of the excess weight. At this moment, the girl was sitting in her room collecting jewelry. She thought he was just going, for she had been against the whole terrible scheme from the beginning. Supplying weapons to a battle that has already been lost long before is really dumb. And now they were going to run away in the middle of the night. The girl thought it was just cheesy. At that moment, however, a man suddenly came into her room. When he saw that the girl had already packed a whole suitcase, he turned to her by name in surprise. Her name was Ignette, and the man had a glass of wine in his hands which he held out to the girl. He also told her to drink, for they had a long journey ahead of them. Ignette looked at him in surprise. She began to scrutinize the man. The girl realized that it was all just a lie. The man who entered smiled evilly, and Ignette didn't know why she should suddenly believe him. The girl was so skeptical because he had absolutely not cared about her for 7 years of marriage. However, the real tragedy is not that he lies to her all the time, but that she has no choice but to simply obey him. So Ignette took the glass and drank the wine from it. But at that moment she suddenly felt some strange taste. She dropped the glass, and it shattered, spilling its contents onto the floor. The man, seeing this, immediately started yelling at her. He called her a fool, and Ignette was in shock. She could not believe that her own husband had actually poisoned her. The girl fell to her knees and looked at her hands, which were covered in blood, and the man at that moment stood over her and laughed, saying that now she was absolutely useless, so there was no reason for him to take her with him. But then he suddenly said that since she'd helped his business grow, he'd mourn her, so be it a little. Ignette tried to appeal to him somehow to help her. However, at that moment her body weakened completely and she fell unconscious to the floor. Her husband stood there laughing for a while. After that, he started to leave after saying goodbye to her. In fact, the girl had never had the power to make her own decisions in her life. However, she didn't want to die more than anything else in the world. And that was that. However, if she still had no choice, the last thing she would want to do was to see his face one last time. As her husband walked down the corridors, he suddenly heard someone's voice behind him. A young boy came up behind him and asked, "Is it really him, the head of the Barons' Trade Association?" He swung his sword at him and then cut off his head ruthlessly without even waiting for an answer. Agneth, who was already exhausted, heard the screams and realized that he had come. This pleased her very much. These men were Hines Ascalon, the one who had won the most horrific war in history. It was he who became the new king of the Baron's empire, her Grand Duke, the one she had dreamed of all her life. Out of her last strength, Ignette opened her eyes and looked at her lover, telling him in a muffled voice that he had come for her after all. She missed him very much. However, it was very sad about the fact that when she finally met him, she didn't have the strength to even properly see his beautiful face. Hines took his beloved girl by the hand and said in a sad voice when he saw her breathless body that he was late after all. She felt the warmth of his hand on her cold one and thought that yes, he was late after all. She didn't know why he was so long. If only he had come a little faster, it would have been completely different. If only he hadn't participated in the conquest of the Black Forest, things might have happened quite differently. The girl wondered what the result would have been then. However, in order to understand how it all came to this, the case needs to look into the past. So now the events that took place 8 years before will be recounted. Ignette was still living on her father's estate. One day he called his daughter together with her maid and told the girl that her wedding would unfortunately not take place. The girl was shocked. However, she asked if she could find out from her father what had happened. Her father replied that the Grand Duke had been sent to the vanguard to conquer the Black Forest, so he would not be able to attend the wedding. The man at this point intends to put the authorized person in his place, so the father said they felt they should do the same. He couldn't see his daughter's distraught face, so he turned away and also said that the Duke would come for her as soon as the campaign was over, but until then, she would stay at his mansion. Soon the father let the girl and her assistant go, and so when they were out the door, the maid immediately asked her mistress if she was all right, because the maid certainly knows how long she has waited for this wedding. However, at that moment, Agneth smiled happily and told her maid named Lena that she was fine. However, the maid still insisted. She said that the bride would not be able to attend her own wedding. How could she be okay after that? Agneth, at that moment restraining her feelings, clutched her dress tighter. In fact, as her maid, she said, she had been looking forward to her wedding since she and the Duke were children. For as long as the girl could remember, she had always been very lonely and almost never smiled because there was no reason to. Her own family, who should love and respect children, simply shunned her. They pretended as if the girl did not exist at all. And being a child, she couldn't resent her parents or beg them for love. Of course she didn't, because she was too young to understand that. Agneth did her best to live up to her parents' expectations, which were quite high. And by doing all these things, she hoped that one day they would love her a little. Time passed, and all the girl got from them in return was nothing but coldness and inflated expectations. And perhaps that's why Agneth was so taken with the idea of becoming the perfect Grand Duchess to prove her parents wrong. And if she had ever become an impeccable duchess, who would do a fine job of housekeeping and caring for people, then, in the girl's opinion, they would finally love her and start giving her their attention. In fact, Hines Ascalon was not just the girl's future husband. He was her last hope, her only way out of this terrifyingly dark room. So waiting for him from a military campaign was almost worthless to the girl, especially compared to how many years she'd already waited, so Agneth kept hoping for the best anyway. And so a considerable amount of time had passed since that moment. The girl sat in her room and, as always at lunchtime, read her book. There was a heavy frost outside the window because it was Suvor winter. The windows were all covered with the most beautiful patterns. At that moment, suddenly, Lena came running in with very loud screams to the girl. She turned to the mistress and said that the master wanted to see her, he said, so it was very urgent. The maid was very excited and agitated. Agneth looked at her at once, and closing the book, asked in surprise, "Did her father really call her, and then what did he say?" Lena smiled and said that she thought the news would be good. The girl always remained optimistic. This time, however, she did have an excuse, for she had overheard a little of the conversation, and in it the name of the Grand Duke was uttered. The maid began to shout joyfully and told her mistress that perhaps the Duke was finally coming for her. Agneta, hearing this, was immediately overjoyed. However, she did not show much emotion, so she simply thanked her maid Lena discreetly and went to meet her father. As the girl ran joyfully through the corridors, she was beyond excited because at last her beloved Duke had arrived. It was a dream for which she had waited all her life, and at last the moment was about to begin. Soon Agneth came to the door of her father's study, and for a while she gathered the strength to knock on it. Soon she knocked, and after that she heard the stern voice of her father, who said that she could come in. As soon as the girl opened the door, she saw that he was very serious, sitting at his desk. Agneta stepped closer to him and, smiling, asked her father if he had summoned her. My father put his head down and said in a quiet voice that it was true. He had called her. After that, he went straight to the point and added that her divorce had finally been finalized, so he would start looking for her next husband very soon. Agneth, who just a second ago had been standing joyful and anticipating her meeting with the Duke, immediately became very sad. She could not believe what her father had said. The girl looked him in the eyes in surprise and asked if she had heard him say something serious about divorce. She stood silent for a while, then asked her father what he meant by making such a loud statement. The girl was trembling with fear and said that it was very sudden and she could not understand anything why it happened. Agneth put her hand to her chest. Her heart was beating inside her at an incredible speed. Then the girl asked in a quiet voice, Did he really say he no longer wanted to marry her? The father didn't care at all about her reaction. However, he still looked away from the girl and said that they had no other choice. And he hoped very much that she would understand, because His Highness had stopped sending them her allowance. Agneth was shocked to hear this. The girl couldn't believe that they had been taking money from the Grand Duke all this time while he was protecting their lands. At this point, her father suddenly raised his voice and said that, of course, they were taking that money since she was already married, and he was no longer responsible for her financially. After that, he said that their discussion was over. She should go back to her room and not ask any more such silly questions. He said he would call her when he was done with the business of her next marriage. Agneth, when she stepped outside the door of her father's study, she was in shock. The girl still did not understand what had happened. However, tears came to her eyes faster and faster. She could no longer hold back her emotions. It was unthinkable for her to obey her father. She had dedicated her life to becoming a flawless Grand Duchess, never asking for anything more. However, everything still eventually came down to money, everything possible, even her sincere love and relationship. The girl had no leverage, let alone power. She couldn't even stand up for herself and defend her point of view. She was a nobody in that family. So Agneth, all that was left was to remarry at her father's behest. And so on the eve of her third wedding, she was suddenly walking down the corridor and heard strange conversations. The girl heard Lena's voice pleading with the Lord to reconsider Agneth's liturgy already on the man he had chosen. Lena asked in surprise if she wasn't their darling daughter. The maid asked very strongly that they postpone the wedding just this once. Of course, the Duke reacted negatively to her words. He took a swing at the girl and called her very insolent, and after that he began to beat her, asking how dare the servants interfere in the affairs of the masters. Agneth, who had been watching through a crack in the door all this time, ran into the room when she heard that the beating was over, and saw her maid lying on the floor with blood already around her. The girl was very surprised, her voice trembling. She started shouting Lena's name to let her know that she was alive. But all was useless. The maid was dead, and the girl kept begging her to wake up and say a little word. Agneth's father sighed heavily at that moment and said that it was all very unfortunate. Then he looked at his daughter and said that this would be a lesson to her. If she or anyone around her dared to go under against his will, they would meet the same fate as the maid. And from that moment, of course, the girl learned his lesson. After all, she still wanted to live, so she lived obediently. In the end, however, she died a miserable death at the hands of her third husband. At that moment, Agneth thought that he would never get rid of her even if he killed her. Just the thought of how she had been used all these years made her furious. That's why she can't just disappear from the face of the earth. And yet the girl is still glad that her lover was there in the last moments of her life and held her hand as she died. And so, after thinking it all over, Agneth finally closed her eyes and drifted off into the world of death. However, things did not happen as she expected. Soon the girl woke up, remembering everything that had happened. It was a clear, sunny day. Birds were singing in the trees near her window, and the sun was shining so brightly that it even came into her room. Agneta, as soon as she opened her eyes, began to breathe heavily. She sat down on the bed, looking around in horror. She did not understand what was happening. She suddenly started touching her face, still not believing that she was really alive. She thought that maybe it was just a dream. However, she then speculated that she might just be in the afterlife after death. As she looked around, she realized she was in her own room at her father's estate. Agneta immediately ran to the mirror and began to scrutinize her face. She noticed that she looked much younger than before her death. She was not sure how old she was at the moment, but she knew for sure that her third wedding had not yet taken place. She started touching her body again, still not believing what was happening. The girl now finally realized that this was not the afterlife or a dream. She was alive somehow. She had returned to the past. Then she fell to the floor and wept bitterly, realizing what a terrible situation she had fallen into. In fact, the girl decided for herself firmly that she no longer wanted to live a life as miserable as the past. At that moment, someone suddenly knocked on her room, and then the door began to open, and a woman's voice told Mistress that she was coming in. Agnete immediately turned in that direction and saw her former maid Lena enter the room. The maid wished her good morning, but the girl didn't listen. She remembered the scene when she had seen her dead. Agnete looked at Lena again and still could not believe that she was really still alive and well. Then the girl suddenly picked herself up from the floor and ran straight to her maid and began to hug her tightly. Agnete then begged them to save her, but it was useless. Nobody listened to her. Then the girl, through her tears, asked Lena if it was true. The maid didn't understand what was going on. Alina looked at Mistress in surprise and was about to ask something, but the girl still continued to cry on her shoulder. Now Agnete understood. She knew why she had returned to the past. She had been given one single chance to correct all her mistakes and not to have such a worthless life as she had lived in the past. The girl was never going to forgive all those who had ruined her and Lena's life. Now her eyes showed not only tears but also eyes filled with hatred and anger. Before long, the maid did pull the mistress away from her, and when she looked at her face, she said in surprise that her eyes were even swollen shut. Lena looked at her regretfully and said that Madam must be upset that she wouldn't be able to attend her own wedding. However, she shouldn't cry. Everything would be fine. Agnete, hearing this, looked at the maid in surprise and then asked whether it was the second or the third wedding. The maid, hearing this, didn't understand what she was talking about, and afterward asked what she meant by it, the first one, of course. Agnete at that moment at once realized and remembered that it meant that this day was to be the wedding day with the Grand Duke Hines Ascalon. After that, the girl cleaned herself up and then went to her father's office. She knocked before entering, of course. The man glanced at her without taking his eyes off his papers and then went back to his business. Then he asked her what was wrong with her for coming to see him all of a sudden. Agnete was angry at this point and thought that he disrespected her so much that he didn't even say hello properly. Then she told her father that she would like to discuss her wedding. The girl said that she thought that at least she herself should take part in it. But the father replied without much enthusiasm that, as he had said, the Duke would send an authorized person. After that, he suddenly became somehow angry and said he sincerely hoped she had a good reason to bring up again this horrible issue that they had already discussed and resolved everything. Agnete asked that her father listen to her and told her that His Highness was unable to attend the ceremony because he had been sent off to war. She also said that if for any reason the Grand Duke approached the king about it, it would put them in an awkward position, especially if they did nothing themselves. And summarizing, the girl added that just in case, at least for her alone, she should take part in the ceremony. And then she asked her father what he thought about it. For a while the man just silently thought and analyzed her words. After that he said that he understood her point of view. When he looked at his daughter and thought for a while, he said that he would let her do it. Agnete was happy to hear this and bowed and thanked her father. After that, she said goodbye to her father and wished him a good day, and then, as she walked out the door, the girl exhaled with relief. There is something that Agnete has turned a blind eye to in past lives, and the important thing for her now is to be able to accept it. Her love for her family has always been unrequited and only one way, so now she is taking her first steps. And no more is the girl going to expect love, affection, or warmth from them. She should leave her family behind and just walk away, without looking back or regretting what they didn't do. This is the only way she can survive and not be influenced by her father, to have her own point of view and her own desires. Not long afterward, the wedding date was finally set, and Agnete was dressed in a wedding gown to dedicate her own wedding. Her mom met her before she left and asked her if she really needed to participate in the ceremony if her husband wasn't even going to be there. The woman looked at her daughter carefully and said that there is nothing so special about weddings. However, she still doesn't understand why the girl is so eager to get there. They had already departed in the carriage going to the wedding, and the girl, lowering her eyes, replied that if she had not gone with her, Agnete would have been left all alone. Her mother turned away from the girl and said she was tired of telling her time and time again that her father and Rosalie had so many other things to worry about, so they couldn't go to the wedding with her. She also irritably said to the girl, "Just don't tell her to feel sorry for herself. The wedding ceremony is just a formality. It doesn't mean anything." Agneta, of course, already knows how her parents feel about her. But yes, she still couldn't stop feeling sorry for herself. The girl could not understand why her pain from her parents' actions could not go away. Soon, the carriage pulled up to the beautiful estate and stopped. The girl thought she needed to pull herself together and concentrate. She had only one thing to think about now. She is finally marrying her first husband again. As soon as the carriage stopped and the door opened, a servant came over and helped the girl out of it. On this day, she marries the only man she has ever loved and who truly existed in her life, Grand Duke Hines Ascalon. As soon as she and her mother stepped out of the carriage, they were immediately greeted by the priest, bowing to the ladies. The man also told them, "Welcome," and wished that they would be blessed by the gods on this wonderful, warmth and joy-filled day. Agneta smiled back at him and thanked him for such wonderful words and welcome from the Holy Father. Then she inquired if he happened to know where His Highness's authorized person was. However, another man soon approached them. Lena, the maid, was the first to notice him. She turned in his direction and addressed her mistress, saying that he was the most handsome man she had ever seen in her life. A tall, dark-haired man approached them, and the maid said it was as if he had come down from heaven. Then he turned his gaze to Agneth and said, smiling, that they had arrived just in time, for the ceremony was about to begin. The girl herself at this moment turned to the Holy Father and asked in surprise, without taking her eyes off the man, if this was the authorized person. The priest smiled and said that he really hoped so, for he had the seal of the Principality of Nienor. However, at this moment, the man who approached them looked at the girl in a spirit of malice, as if with a hint of arrogance. Agneth saw the look in his eyes and was very surprised. She didn't understand what that look was, or why he was suddenly looking like that. But at that moment a man came closer to her, and leaned over and said that he was very glad to meet her. Everyone called her Lady Herkea. The girl said she was excited to meet him too. After that, she said that she was probably just making things up for herself. At that moment, the girl's mother also entered the conversation. She came closer to the man and asked, "Is he really the Grand Duke's attorney?" She had something she wanted to give to the Duke, and asked if she could tell it to him instead of the Lord. The man replied to the Duchess that of course she could do so. The woman then smiled unashamedly and said that the ransom the Duke had sent was ridiculous to say the least. How on earth could she marry off her daughter for such a worthless sum? Agnete and her maid were shocked when they heard this. The girl did not understand how she could even say such a thing. However, the man simply smiled and said that she must be deeply disappointed by such news. He put his hand to his pocket and asked, "Is 10,000 gold coins a worthless sum to them?" However, the girl's mother was genuinely surprised to hear these words. She could not believe it, for her husband had said that the Duke had sent them only 3. The woman assumed that the Lord had probably appropriated the rest. However, she could not believe that this was really the case, for she trusted him with all her heart. But suddenly she was interrupted from her thoughts by Agnete's voice. She hugged her mother and asked her to stop this useless conversation. The mistress looked at her in surprise and asked what she meant by that. Then the girl with the weather-beaten voice replied that there were a lot of eyes and extra ears in this place. They could ruin the image of herself and His Highness. Agnete said her father would just be furious if he found out, and she added that they didn't want to ruin their family's name, after all. The woman was silent for a while. After that, she nodded and said that she wasn't feeling well, so she was going to go sit down. At last, she said that she had done her duty in coming to this place. And turning to her daughter, she added that she hoped very much that she would not say afterward that she had not been there for such a solemn moment. Agnethe's mother thought she could handle the rest on her own. Enough people have seen this shame, and now even in the eyes of the Duke's attorney the girl is very ashamed to look. The girl, without turning around, apologized to him for such behavior, and said it was all because of her mother's grief to give her eldest daughter away in marriage again. The man smiled and looked at her in surprise and said, "It's clear," sorrowfully, she said. Then the priest intervened in their conversation and, laughing nervously, suggested that they should already continue their ceremony. He turned to His Highness's lady and attorney and asked that they follow him. Soon they entered the room, and the priest asked that they wait in the room for a while. He bowed and said he would come back for them when the ceremony officially began. Then he walked out the door, leaving the man and the woman alone. At that moment, Agnes glanced at the boy who was standing next to her. He came up to her and wanted to say something. However, the girl also turned to him and wanted to apologize. Then the man stopped and asked that she continue, laughing because of the awkward situation. The girl laughed awkwardly too and thanked him for that. After that, she said she would like to ask him for a favor. She pulled an envelope from her dress and handed it to the man, asking if he could give this to His Highness. He looked at the envelope in surprise and asked what kind of document it was. The girl laughed and replied that not everything in the envelope was actually some important document. Agnes said he must be used to his administrative duties alone. However, this is still not an important document, but her personal message. She bowed and said that it was only her letter. However, it is very important, so the girl hoped he could get it to the Duke personally. And then Agnes, a little shyly, looked at him and asked if he could pass on one more thing. The girl said that she really hoped that the Duke could send a reply directly, rather than sending a letter to the manor. She would very much like to keep their communication with him a secret from her family. However, the man suddenly asked if he could wonder why she wanted to remain so anonymous from her family. Agnes at this point apologized and said that was all she could say to him. She could say no more. Then the man replied that he understood everything, and if His Highness answered, he would be sure to give the letter to her personally. The girl smiled and said that of course she was sure that he would definitely answer her. However, here suddenly the man became more serious and said that she seemed convinced right there. Agneta did not understand why he was so surprised by this, and she replied that of course she was convinced. And all because His Highness was the only one who was there to hold her hand when she took her last breath. Of course, the girl didn't tell him that, but only thought about it. And then she laughed and said that he was her husband now, so she was sure he would definitely respond. The man decided not to ask her any more questions, and with a sigh, replied that he would pass everything on to His Highness since she was asking for it. Agnes. This news pleased her very much. She thought that, of course, perhaps she would not be able to see him. However, at least they would be able to communicate somehow. So she thanked him, and afterward she asked him what he wanted to say. But at that moment one of the servants came up to them and said that the high priest had already arrived for the ceremony, so he wanted to show them into the hall. Then the man glimpsed at her and said that apparently they had more important business to attend to than what he wanted to tell her. He then extended his hand to escort her and asked if they were on their way. The girl accepted his hand, and then they went to the ceremony. Then Agnes thought of the fact that from this day forward she was again the wife of Grand Duke Hines Ascalon. This is the dream that she had once already given up, without even trying to fight for her happiness. This time, however, she'll grab it with all her might. In fact, Emperor Baran had 2 sons. The older one was very kind, but rather weak. The younger one was narcissistic and greedy. The emperor loved them both, and after much deliberation, he divided the kingdom into 2 parts to please everyone. The eldest got the part of the kingdom that was bigger and warmer, and the youngest in turn got a small part of the land that was deserted and barren. The youngest son became enraged at this injustice. He poisoned his own father and forged his will. Because of this, the elder brother was forced to live in the lifeless lands of Nienor, and that city was reduced, but never gained status in the Asal lands. The conquest of the Black Forest was the result of the tyranny of a king. Then one day, a portal opened and a man came out of it. Hines Ascalon, who was at this moment on a special military campaign in this very dark forest, returned to his royal tent. The man was talking to someone and said that long distance requires a lot more mana stones. He was told that it takes an extremely skilled wizard to do magic. Hines's interlocutor was amazed that he could teleport such a great distance in just one go. However, the lad replied as he entered the tent that he was now very tired anyway. He was told that this girl was now his wife. However, it did not understand why he could not get into her mind. Hines said that if he did not know it himself, then who should know it? At that moment he began to remove the sword from his belt and placed it beside him on the chair. This voice said that he hadn't met any people yet, and he couldn't have gotten in yesterday. However, the boy replied that he had not met anyone but himself. The voice answered him that he had a special connection to the mana stones and was an unusual person. Hines lit candles to avoid sitting in the dark and said it was only to their advantage, otherwise he wouldn't even exist. That voice came from his sword, and he said that if it was all presented like that, however, he stopped and said that, however, perhaps this girl wasn't as simple as she seemed at first glance either. Hines said she didn't look like she had any special powers, not to mention that he now knew what the Duchess wanted from him. The voice from the sword agreed, and said that this woman clearly couldn't wait to rip him off to the bone. She wasn't even close to thinking about her daughter's well-being. However, the man then said that compared to that horrible woman, that girl, his wife, she was nothing like her mother. They are not similar in appearance, nor in manner of speech or behavior, which is why the guy is so suspicious. He has no idea what thoughts live behind those beautiful eyes. And even more alarming to Hines was the letter his assistant handed him from this very girl. In this letter, Ignette addressed the dear Grand Duke and said that she could not express how glad she was to have the opportunity to write him a letter like this. Now, after that great day, her name is Ignette Ascalon, and she is his lawful wife and he her lawful husband. The girl hopes very much that he will not forget this. On these rights, therefore, Ignette had one request to make to him. Soon her father would ask him to pay some kind of allowance for her, which the Duke, as befits a real man, would of course agree to and send him. However, instead of paying her father, the girl asks that he send her this allowance personally. That was exactly what Ignette's first request was, and the girl wrote that if he did agree to fulfill it, she would guarantee him her faithful devotion. She will also look forward to seeing them again. At the end, the girl also wrote that there is such a possibility that her father might send him a divorce request, so Ignette asks that he just tear him into small pieces. Hines reread the letter again, wondering what she was talking about. He was curious about this girl, for he did not understand what she was trying to accomplish. The man said that he had relied on the sword's ability to read other people's minds for too long. Now he had to read her emotions himself, listen to what she was saying, and it was really annoying him. Then the sword asked in surprise, "Isn't that how all ordinary people live?" He didn't understand why he was making such a claim, because it was perfectly natural. At that moment, a man with blue hair suddenly walked into the king's tent. He turned to the boss and cheerfully said that he was back, even earlier than the guy expected, and that made him happy. Hines agreed without much enthusiasm, and said that it was just the way things were. He then asked if he had accidentally missed anything, and if there was any news about his father. The guy replied that they had received one warning very recently, but no one had ever responded to it. The Duke then replied that it was a very good job, because the father should be aware that he personally attended the ceremony. The lad replied to his boss that of course he knew how the man felt about matters pertaining to the kingdom, and his father had been furious when he found out he was being sent to the front. The guy also said that it is nothing more than a political marriage. However, the family on his wife's side is demanding some of the money allocated for the trek. Now he understands why the gentleman was so reluctant to show up at his own wedding. Hines sighed heavily and replied that the wedding would have taken place regardless of his presence there, so he saw fit not to come. His assistant started to come out of the tent and said that was correct. He would leave it at that, and also said goodnight to the boss. However, the Duke, before the guy left, asked that Kane stay and said he needed him to find out everything he could. Hines wants to find out about Herke's family and his newly minted Grand Duchess. After that, his assistant went about his business. A fair amount of time had passed since their wedding, and soon Ignette and her maid were outside. The carriage was already waiting for them, which was soon to depart. The coachman bowed to the lady and said that he had been informed that the girl intended to visit the shopping district, so he would gladly take her there. Ignette, hearing this, immediately glanced at her maid and realized that it was probably Lita's doing. She was very worried about her. Then the girl shifted her gaze to Coachman, who held out his hand to her and asked her permission for him to accompany her. Ignette took a closer look at the man, and immediately realized that this was the same man who had accompanied her on her wedding day. She didn't really remember his name, but she figured he was most likely a Grey Grike. He had worked for Sir Halbert when she was a child. The girl thought that even though he was doing this at Lena's request, she was still very grateful to him for his help. So she put her hand in his and said that she gladly agreed. But before she got into the carriage, Ignette suddenly heard someone shouting. A woman's voice was calling her. When she turned around, she saw her sister running joyfully toward them. Ignette was very surprised. Then she turned to Rosalie and asked if she was all right. The girl replied that she was all right, and after that she asked if she could go to the patroness's meeting for her, because Rosalie had some urgent business to attend to, and she just can't not go there. The nurse replied in a calm tone that she would have to go there herself or inform her that she was not coming. However, she would have to do it herself. Rosalie was indignant and said she would not do that. After all the patrons would be there, and if she didn't show up, she would tarnish her reputation. The girl looked at her sister and said that she was going somewhere anyway after all, and she didn't see why she couldn't just stop there on the way. Then Rosalie blamed her and told the girl to go in there just for a minute, put her name in the attendance book. After all, they are sisters and should always help each other. Agneth was shocked by this outpouring of love from her sister. But at that moment, Rosalie suddenly let her go and said that since everything was settled, she should go. The girl relied on her sister. Agneth wanted to object, but the girl had run away and was out of earshot. Mistress suddenly sighed heavily, not realizing when she was going to grow up. Then Lena suddenly turned to her and asked what she was going to do. Was she really going to show up for that meeting? Agneth, however, on entering the carriage, replied that not at all. She was not going to do that, so they were going to Rivertown. The maid was very surprised to hear this and asked why the lady was going there. Agneth answered that she had some business there, so they were going there and would not turn back. The girl at that moment remembered the silhouette of a guy she knew in her past life and said that she needed to meet someone there. It was very important. In fact, in her past life, poor Agneth was simply forced to work for her husband's trade association. The business was as successful as it could be. However, despite the girl's best efforts, there was never even a small share left for her. Success scattered like sand through her fingers, and her fiancé was taking everything for himself, not giving her even the small pinch she deserved by doing her job flawlessly. Now, however, Agneth was back in that time and was about to do something different. After a while, the carriage pulled up to the desired location, and the girl stepped inside. Agneta said hello to Miss, who was sitting inside, and said that she had noticed the store was for sale, so she was very interested in buying it. This time, the girl is going to achieve success on her own and not depend on anyone else. Soon, they discussed all the details, and the girl gave her special papers that the mistress had to sign. The lady said it is a contract and the ownership of the building as they agreed. The store will be cleaned up by next week, and then she will give the lady the key. Agneth scrutinized the papers the girl had given her for a while. Afterwards, she smiled, for she saw her name on them. Soon the conversation was over. The girl left the store, and the saleswoman said goodbye to her and said then they would see each other next week. Then Lena suddenly turned to Mistress in a whisper and asked if she was sure she wanted to spend her savings on this. The maid also said that of course she had been offered a very good discount, but she had been saving up for so many years. Agneth was very surprised, but then smiled and replied that everything was fine. If she hadn't spent the money, it would have been taken away from her anyway, so it was a very good investment. Many may wonder how a girl like her managed to get enough money to buy her own store. However, it's really simple. Agneta used to visit a temple when she was younger, and on one of her visits, she had the opportunity to translate texts from the East. And despite the fact that she was offered work intermittently, working gradually and persistently over several years, she was still able to save some money. In a past life, the girl's mom found these savings and ruthlessly took them from her. Agneta turned to her maid and started pointing in a direction. She told her to pay attention to the street opposite the beautiful store. The lady said that even though the building itself is quite old, however, it is located near busy streets where quite a large number of people pass by. So it's a great place that can attract the attention of passers-by. People will pass by and see her store, then they will be interested and go inside. And when they see the assortment, they will definitely want to buy something. Agneth asked joyfully what more could be desired for the store. The building needed a little renovation, and it would start attracting crowds of people. Well, the girl thought that of course she had some information that she got from her past life. However, Lena still doubted such stories of the girl. Agneth laughed. She was pleased that the maid was so worried about her, She said, however, that everything would be all right. They soon returned to the loin, and the lady said she had one more thing left to do. Then she turned to Sir Herc, asking if he could take them to the marketplace of Arran. In fact, the really important business for the girl starts right now when they head to the market. Gurk helped her into the carriage and replied that he should warn her. It was not the safest place. Agneth smiled and said that in that case it was very good that he had come with her and agreed to accompany her. When Mistress was already inside, she said she would like to ask him to continue when they got to the market. Then the attendant and her maid got into the carriage, and they listened carefully to her request. Lena immediately became angry and told Her Highness that there was no way they could do that. The maid screamed loudly and didn't understand how they could leave her there alone. After all, it was too dangerous. Agneth knew that there would be such a violent reaction, but calmly she said that she had to meet someone at that place, and she had to get him on her side. However, he is extremely cautious, and if the two of them are near the girl, it is unlikely that this man will even approach her. That man was Isaac Bakun. He was only a year younger than the girl, and came from a noble family that had long ago disappeared. And because of his exceptional talent, he took over as general manager of her husband's bidding and association, and he was the only person who treated Agneth with any sincerity. Isaac stayed by her side even during off hours, telling her various stories through which she could escape from the reality that was suffocating her. And the only clue to his whereabouts that the girl had at the moment was that when he was a kid, he used to pickpocket on the streets of the Arran market. The plan the girl came up with was ridiculously simple. She would walk around the market alone, holding her purse as bait. If someone does try to steal her, it will be with the help of Sir Grick, who is watching her from the front, or Lena's assistant who's watching her back. They'll catch him after all. Agneth, of course, probably did not know about the meeting with Isaac on that day. She was not even sure whether she would be able to talk to him at all. But she has no other way. It was either that or no way at all. So the girl set out to retrace her steps to lure the guy. A fair amount of time had passed since she had started, and the sun had already begun to go below the horizon, and the girl kept walking on and on. Soon, Agneta turned the corner and saw that it was just the last street she could go around. In fact, since they had started, they had caught quite a few thieves. However, none of them turned out to be Isaac. At that moment, the girl even suggested that perhaps she had simply not noticed him, or perhaps he had realized that she was not alone, so he did not even try. Agneth decided to herself that if she didn't find him that day, she would get caught again the next day. However, at that moment, a boy suddenly approached her from behind. After that, he carefully grabbed her purse, which the girl was holding in her hand, and started to run away with her. Agneta, sensing this, immediately turned towards him. She could not see his face, because she could only see the back of his head, but she recognized the golden hair, which she could never confuse with anything else. It was Isaac. Then the girl suddenly turned to her assistant Lena, who had just come out from around the corner, and told her not to let him escape in any way. However, the guy was confused for a while, but after that he just shoved the girl and ran on his own. Agneta immediately ran up to her maid. She saw that Lena was holding her shoulder and almost crying. The girl asked if she was all right. The maid apologized to Her Highness, saying that she couldn't hold it in. But at that moment, they suddenly heard someone's indignant shouts, and when they looked to the side, they saw that it was Grick. But he wasn't alone. The man had managed to catch the boy after all. The girls, as soon as they looked at it, were very surprised. Agneta did not expect him to be able to react so quickly. The girl had no idea that her escort was in such good physical condition that he caught up with the guy from the other end of the alley. Grick held the boy so that he couldn't run out. After that, he turned to Her Highness and told her that he had caught him after all. The boy started to pull out. However, he was certainly not able to do so. He was begging to be let go. Grick suddenly turned to him in a menacing voice, asking if he even had the nerve to infringe on the property of a defenseless woman. He should at least have pride, if he had no money. Then Isaac suddenly cried out and asked if this guy would try starving. He would then look at him. What would he do in such a situation? Would he forget his pride? The guy said that all their pride and character were all pretty words, but they are of no use when you don't even have a piece of bread. Isaac continued to scream. He said he had it all once, and it seemed to him then that there was nothing more important in life. But when he lost absolutely everything, he just despaired. And then life taught him a real lesson. He asked that if he were to die right here and now, then what was the point of it all? Of course, he knows very well that stealing is not a very honorable thing to do. However, he shouted at everyone who caught him and said that they had no right to condemn him and his actions. If they themselves were never afraid of starving to death, there was absolutely nothing to talk to him about. Agneth was very hurt to hear all these words. However, she soon thought of something to say to him, but thought it would probably sound like an excuse. Then the girl came closer to him and told him his first and last name. The guy was suddenly very surprised, asking how she even knew his name. But Agneth doesn't do it because she wants to use him for her own gain. She remembered the grown-up Isaac saying that when he was stealing, all he could do was keep in his heart his empty wishes that he thought would never come true. And so, as the boy told her his stories, even though he had managed to escape his unhappy past after all, his voice was full of sadness and loneliness. Agneta once suddenly wondered what desires he had to get rid of. The boy did not say that, for example, if he was caught, he would be taken by the hand and not only to be dragged into a prison cell. So that was the main reason why the girl started to feel some sympathy for him. Agneta came closer to the guy, and afterwards extended her hand to him, asking him if he would like to work for her. The girl wished to reach out to young Isaac to fulfill the empty wish he had kept in his heart all these years. She was going to reach out to him like he had dreamed of all his life, not to send him to a jail cell or punish him, but to get him out of this horrible life. Agneth thought at that moment that he could not even imagine how happy he had made her in her most difficult times. In fact, no matter how hard Isaac tried, he couldn't stop thinking about the guy. Time after time he thought of the words he had heard from a nobleman. They said that they had been stealing from the unfortunate residents to do their dirty deeds, so they should take everything away from the Bayouns and execute them. The guy could never understand why his family took the blame, and why they didn't let themselves be killed so easily, and why he, the weakest link, managed to survive. How the guy wishes that someday someone would reach out to him, give him the strength to get up and avenge everything that had happened to him. So you can understand Isaac's surprise when the girl offered to help him. He could not believe his happiness, for he had not even hoped for such a thing. They were soon back in the girl's carriage, and when all were seated, Ignet said that surely no better place for conversation could be found. The girl then looked at the guy and realized that he was still wary. However, at least he looked calmer. Ignet thought that still, however, they would not be able to talk, and in the carriage it would be much easier and quieter. Then the girl spoke first. She turned to Isaac and asked him if he wanted revenge. The boy was surprised to hear this, for he had never said such a thing to anyone. He was silent for a while, thinking about what had happened, and afterward looked at the girl and stammered and asked how she knew about it. Ignet calmly replied that it wasn't the most important thing he needed to know at the moment. The truth is that the true heir to the Baekun family is him, not his brother, and that his family didn't deserve all that has happened to them. So the only question that matters at this point is whether he wants revenge. Isaac said after thinking for a while that he lost everything. His parents, his only brother, and it all happened in one moment. So, of course, he wants revenge on the people who did all this. The guy was dead serious, and the girl was pleased at this point. She thought that was exactly the answer she had been waiting for. That's the kind of man he was. For even to accomplish his revenge, he had infiltrated the ranks of the enemy association and was patiently waiting for the right moment to conjure up his plan. Well then, Ignet said he needed power to do all this. The fact that he was once the heir to his family was not enough for her to trust him with the job. Then the girl asked him to look out the window. Isaac, of course, looked out at once, just as she had said. Then she asked if he could see that small store across the street. The boy began to scrutinize the building, and after that, the girl told him to prove himself, work, and gain influence. Step by step, she asked him if he would be up to the task. At this point, tears suddenly flowed from the guy's eyes. He started to cover his face with his hands and said that of course he would show her what he could do. Ignet hugged him to comfort him a little and told him it was a fine choice. Now, let him come back in 3 days, work hard, and then she will reward him according to his success. In fact, the girl just wants him to be able to exact his revenge and live the life his soul desires, because he, more than anyone else, deserves it. Then the girl thought about the fact that probably the same is true for her. She must also take revenge in order to continue living with a clear conscience. Soon the boy calmed down, and then he got out of the carriage. Ignet's assistants came inside. Grick immediately asked his mistress if this was the man she was looking for. The girl looked at Isaac and said happily that he was the one. The guy was surprised. However, he said he wouldn't ask her how she even knew about him. He also said that he realizes that this guy was once part of the influential Bay Crown Sasia. However, now this Isaac is just a little thief who can't even feed himself. He also asked the lady if she was sure of her choice. Ignet said that he could not worry because the boy was still young, but he already had a clear goal and purpose. They were silent for a while, but the lady said she had another request for them. Ignet asked that they forget everything they had seen, for it was a matter of life and death for the boy. Lena immediately smiled and told Mistress that she needn't worry. They wouldn't tell anyone about all this. Ignet was absolutely sure of Lena. She had never for a moment given any reason to doubt her. Sir Gurkha, however, aroused her suspicions. In fact, working in a trade association had taught the girl to see the true nature of people. At that moment, the man bowed and said that she could have no doubts about their loyalty. The girl looked at him carefully, and afterward thought she could be absolutely certain that neither of them would betray him. Ignet suddenly thought about the fact that if she remembered everything correctly, Gurk had always been there to help her if she had a sudden fall as a child, and had even accompanied her to the temple library from time to time. The girl pondered on how she could get him on her side after all. They were all silent for a while, and then Ignet suddenly asked him if he was loyal to House Herkyai. Gurk, hearing her question, thought for a while. A note of doubt could be seen on his face. Soon, however, he looked her straight in the eye and told her that he hadn't really made up his mind yet. Ignet, hearing this, was very surprised. She was silent for a while, and then said that she had once been told that it was very important for a knight to whom he was loyal. She asked if what she had said was correct. The man was silent for a while and then said that it was correct. Then they continued driving in silence. The girl suggested that her new assignment might even take some time. However, if she still managed to gain his trust, that would be fine. Ignet asked if he could do her a favor, namely, she wanted Gurk to think a bit before he made his choice. The man was silent for a while, pondering her proposal. Then he waved in agreement and said that of course he would fulfill her request. Ignet smiled happily at that moment and thanked him for it, and thought to herself that perhaps he would choose her over Herxie's house. Then all of a sudden, the mistress's belly began to make some strange noises, and everyone immediately heard it and paid attention. The girl felt uncomfortable about it. Then she remembered that they hadn't eaten anything since morning. Then she turned to Lena and told her to ask Kucher to take them to the nearest restaurant. The maid said that of course she would convey everything, and soon the carriage pulled up in front of the restaurant. When they entered, they immediately ordered a variety of dishes to fill themselves up. As they began their meal, Lena turned to the lady and asked what she had decided about the meeting Lady Rosalie had mentioned. Ignet calmly replied that she had already made up her mind and had no intention of going there, and the maid, hearing this, was very much surprised. The mistress, seeing her reaction, said that she shouldn't be so surprised. However, the maid replied that in fact she was just sure that Ignet would go, so the refusal came as a surprise to her. However, of course, the maid was right. Ignet used to be very gullible and immediately agreed with Rosalie's sweet talk. It was hard not to fulfill her naive little sister's requests. But now everything has changed, and the girl has much more important things to do than these unnecessary meetings. She needs to focus on herself. She can't let her family get in her way. Therefore, Ignet replied, Rosalie is already 17 years old. Therefore, she needed to learn to take responsibility for her own actions. They were about to continue their meal when suddenly a lady approached them. She turned to Ignet and asked in surprise, "Is it really her?" The girl immediately shifted her gaze to the stranger, and when she saw her face, she immediately recognized her. It was Lady Lisa. "I wish." The lady laughed and said she was looking for her at the temple. However, she was informed that she was already married, so Lisa congratulated Lady Ignet. The girl herself thanked her, continuing to drink her wine. And afterward, the old acquaintance said that she understood that she should now address them as Grand Duchess Ignet. And having said these words, she laughed again. However, at this moment, the girl moved on to more important matters and asked, why did she seek her after all? Lisa suddenly became sad and at the same time said seriously that she would like to ask her for a small favor. "I wish," the lady immediately made all that she wanted to say and asked if the girl would agree to it. Ignet asked in surprise, Does she really want to be an interpreter? However, the girl said that she had never done such a thing in her life. But Lady Lisa objected and said that she already had the skills and talent, and besides, it would only take about 3 hours of her time. I wish. The lady suddenly became sad and said that the interpreter they had specially hired would not be able to attend. And after all, the guests from the East are extremely important, so they just vitally need a new interpreter as soon as possible. In fact, this Lady Lisa's husband had a trade deal with the Orient, and since books were part of it, they and often Ignette was asked to translate them. At that moment, the girl thought that she couldn't refuse. After all, it was only thanks to Lisa that she had managed to save some money. So she smiled and said that in that case they had found it, and she would gladly give them a few hours for such a case. Lady Liza at once rejoiced and said that it was just wonderful, and thanked the girl, saying that she was now in her debt. She then asked if she would be free for the next 10 days. The girl replied that of course she would be free. Then Lisa said goodbye to her and told her that she would send a carriage for her, and apologized for disturbing them. She also told them to continue to enjoy their meal, and that they would see Ignette in 10 days. Some more time passed, and they finally finished their meal. They had eaten every last crumb, but they were full. They started to leave the store, and Lena asked if they were coming back already. Mistress said that of course they would be on their way home, because it was already quite late. It was already beginning to get dark outside, and they were heading to their wagon. The maid turned to her mistress and said she wanted to ask about that store, what she planned to do with it in general. Ignette smiled and said that of course she was going to start a business. The maid, hearing this, was very surprised and asked, "Is she really going to start her own business?" The girl smiled and said that of course she wasn't really going to do it, but planned to assign Isaac to the case. They soon saw a very happy family as they passed by, and Ignette, looking more closely, saw Rosalie. The girl's surprise from there even stopped. She saw their happy faces, the way they were walking and laughing. It made her feel even more resentful, and afterward, she remembered the words of her sister, who said that she had some urgent business to attend to, so she just wouldn't be able to make it to this celebration. But at that moment, she was suddenly interrupted from her thoughts by someone's sobbing. When the girl turned to the side, she saw that tears were streaming down Lena's cheeks. Ignette put her arm around her and wondered why she was crying. The maid immediately began to wipe away her tears. Of course, she was crying because of the situation she had seen with her mistress. The girl, when she realized this, said that there was nothing wrong with it. It was certainly not worth crying over. However, the niece suddenly looked at her in surprise and asked how she could even say such a thing. After all, she had also heard Rosalie say that she had an emergency. Lena could not understand how this girl could do such a thing, but Ignette replied that it was all right. She had things to do, and asked her not to be upset. Afterward, under the escort of the moon and the night, they finally headed home to get some rest after such a hard and busy day. At this very time, in his special military tent, Hines Ascalon decided to go through some papers again before going to bed. And then suddenly this love sheet from the girl came to his attention again, and he began to reread it. At this moment, the man thought that Duke Luther Herkia is a cold-blooded, greedy, and calculating person. He is practically the hands and feet of Emperor Baron. A man of this position has a daughter who so seldom appears in public that Socius has almost forgotten her existence. Her blonde hair was completely different from the shades of her parents' hair colors. This girl is beautiful and modest, and that was all Hines Ascalon knew about her. The man sighed and smiled as he reread the letter, thinking that she didn't really seem modest to him. It was clear from her eyes that she was in a lot of pain. However, she quickly pulled herself together and pretended that everything was all right. This girl prevented her own mother from asking for money, and then asked her own mother to send the money to her directly. In fact, the guy couldn't even think what she might have been up to committing such actions. He put the letter aside and sighed heavily, realizing he didn't like all of this. One thing he can say for sure, however, is that her letters are neither pretext nor cover. Ignette Herkai sincerely wishes to communicate directly with him. The boy thought about the fact that since his sword couldn't hear her thoughts, there was only one thing left for him to do: figure it out for himself. Also, Hines is going to pretend to be the attorney for as long as he can. Then he activated his ability to teleport somewhere and thought of the location of Herkai's house.